Welcome to today's math lesson. We are talking about decimals with division now, and specifically we're going to talk today about how to deal with decimals in the dividend. So you can see that I've used the division house and then wrote the word dividend where the dividend would actually be. Pretty clever, huh? Anyway, make sure you get the date in the green box and push pause on the video until you get your journal set up the correct way. All right. This is actually not too complicated. It just has some additional steps when it comes to division. So what I want to have us do is let's go ahead and just draw a green line to separate the title from our writing. And we are going to begin with step number 1. The very first thing you want to do is search for those decimals. And if there is decimals, and specifically if they're in the dividend, then there is a step you need to do. So we're going to write step number 1. Let's color that purple. We're going to say if a decimal is in the dividend, if there is a decimal in the dividend, move it straight up into the quotient. That is really, really important. So I'm going to be drawing this green arrow. You move it straight up into the quotient. When you move it straight up, it has to be in the right place value. So we'll say must remain in the same place value. That's why we say move it straight up. It specifically needs to be there. It needs to stay there. Okay, that's really, really important. And then step number 2, after you've moved the decimal straight up into the quotient, you just continue with normal division. So that's pretty interesting. We're going to do another purple, step number 2. Didn't seem super complicated. Color it purple. Step number 2 is to continue with normal division. We're going to write steps. Continue with normal division steps using the standard method. Okay, what this is going to do when we are doing division like this is it is going to, well, first of all, there are a lot of different ways to actually do this. This way that Ms. Fisher is listing out for you is a way that we're going to learn how to do together. There is a way to do this using place value boxes, and when we meet together in groups, I will go over that. But I think in general, the best way for you to learn how to do this is to use the standard method. So even though there's other ways, it's to use the standard method, okay? Standard method means that we use the division box. That is standard method, long division, okay? That's what I mean when I say that. Okay, that really is it when it comes to adding additional things for what we have to do. But slide your journal down, because what's going to happen is I'm going to list some warnings here, things that might come up. So we could draw a stop sign if we want. We could draw like a warning hazard sign. It doesn't really matter how you want to do this. I am just going to write it pretty big, all caps. And then I am going to make it look like it's a hazard sign. some things that might come up with division, especially when we're dealing with decimals. I want you to be very, very careful and follow or look for these warnings, okay? You might have to add a 0 to the end of the dividend so you can bring numbers down. All right, like when we get left with the remainder, you might have to add zeros at the end of the dividend. If you do this, you got to put the decimal in the quotient where it belongs. If the decimal is already in the quotient, like you've already placed the decimal in the quotient, then it's totally fine. So we're gonna try to explain that the best way possible, and then I'm gonna show you an example, okay? So we're going to write this. You might have to add a 0 at the end of the dividend. It's one of these zeros, the ghost 0. You might have to add a 0 to the end of the dividend. So you can bring numbers down. We'll say so you can bring it down to the end of the remainder. This is what we talked about the last time we had math. That was hard. To the end of the remainder. Oh, this eraser is terrible. There's a pretty bad smudge on my paper. Let's try that again. You might have to add a 0 to the end of the dividend so you can bring it down to the end of the remainder. Okay, if you've added zeros at the end of the dividend, the rule is that you had to put a decimal up in the quotient, right? So we're going to put with parentheses here if there already is a decimal in the quotient, dot, dot, dot. Great. You don't need to add another decimal. The numbers that we're dealing with are not going to have more than one decimal. So it says if there already is a decimal in the quotient, great. That is super important. If there already is a decimal in the quotient, it's great. You don't need to do anything else. But on this one, if there is not a decimal in the quotient yet, you must put one at the end. If there is not a decimal in the quotient yet, you must put one at the end before you drop down a 0. And that's that ghost 0, remember? Before you drop down a 0. So those are some warnings. You're really going to have to pay attention to where the decimal is at, and if you already have one or if you need one. Remember, if you've already put one up in the quotient, you don't need to add another one, which is great. You just like check it off and move on, right? If there's not a decimal in the quotient yet, you must put one at the end before you drop down a ghost 0, before you drop down that 0. And then just another little reminder. We're going to do this one green, and I'm going to make it a star. So I'm going to make it a pretty big star. A reminder is you may not use we'll say an R as your remainder if there are zeros. I mean decimals. Sorry. Involved. You really can't in any way. If it's in the dividend, if it's in the quotient, any of those things, you cannot use a little r or the whole number as your remainder if there are decimals involved. You must drop down ghost zeros. Okay, you must drop those down and use decimals. We'll say and use a decimal in the quotient. So again, it says you may not use an R as your remainder or a whole number or even a fraction. You can't do any of that if there are decimals involved. You must drop down that zero, a ghost zero, and use a decimal in the quotient. So this is just quite frankly, it should just be a little bit of a review, but we've only added one little other step. And what's that other step? Is that there's going to be a decimal in the dividend, and you have to bring it up into the quotient. So that was a lot of steps for us to go through without doing any examples. So let's move ahead and turn the page, and let's try some of those examples, okay? I would like to solve 6 problems on this page. That's right, 6 problems. So we need to make 6 rectangles or squares, but what I want us to do is to actually make 3 columns. So let me explain. I'm going to do 2 lines going down that are purple. I went down my whole paper. And then I'm going to do only 1 line that goes across. Do you see how that gave me 6 rectangles? We've got this one on the left, got the one in the middle, then the one on the right. I'm just kind of outlining these in darker purple. And then I've got these 3 across the bottom. Okay? All right, there are my 6 practice problems that we're going to do. The very first one that we're going to do, it goes like this. 6.57 divided by 9. So let's go ahead and put this. I'm going to use the red line as my division bar. 6.57. Space your numbers out. Those numbers should not be touching each other at all. Double check your numbers. If they are touching each other, or if your decimal is touching one of the numbers, I would like you to rewrite it. Thank you. And we're dividing it by 9. Okay. So our first step is to search for decimals now. And there is a decimal, and it is in the dividend. So step number 1 in my journal says, if there is a decimal in the dividend, move it straight up into the quotient. It must remain in the same place value. Let's move it straight up. Okay, so move it up. Make it bold. Okay, so you see the place value that it's in is in between the ones and the tenths. Ones and tenths. Okay. Will 9 go into 6? No. And in this case, instead of placing X's, we place zeros. If that's too confusing, you can just leave it blank. I'm just going to put a 0. Like, no, it does not go into 6. Okay, will 9 go into 65? Yes. How many times? It will go in there 7 times. So you write a 7 on the quotient line. 9 times 7 is 63. Oh, so when you move the decimal straight up, It's like it never even existed. It's kind of like using a decimal box. Does that make sense? So move it straight up, and then it's like we're dealing with 65 instead of 6.5. Okay, so move it straight up, and now it's like we're saying it's, right? It's 65. 9 goes into 65 7 times, which would be 63. So you put a 7 on the quotient line and minus 63. For those of you who are really good at math, it's not actually minusing 63, it's minusing 6.3. But I'm just going to pretend that that didn't happen, okay? What's 65 minus 63? It's 2. For those of you who really want to know, it's 0.2. But just go ahead and write 2. And the next process of division is to bring down the next number. Okay, you start over. 9 goes into 27 exactly 3 times. So I finish out my division and my subtraction, showing that it's a 0, because 9 times 3 is 27. So what is my answer? It's 0.73. Will you please circle that in green? Pretty cool. 0.73. All right. Next. 36.41 divided by 5. Okay, you move the decimal straight up into the dividend. Will 5 go into 3? No, so you can place a 0 or you can place an X. I'll place a 0. Will 5 go into 36? Yeah, 7 times. You need to take 5 times 7 and subtract that from 36. You need to bring down the next number. And you start the process over again. Be mindful of the decimal. The decimal is supposed to be in between the ones place and the tenths place. It holds a specific place. Your numbers need to really line up. Okay, start over. Will 5 go into 14? Yes. Almost 3 times. That would be 15 though. So it goes in 2 times. Put that on the quotient line. And 5 times 2 is 10, so you subtract 10 from 14. And you're left with 4. And you bring down the last one. Okay, you start the process over again. Right now it says 7.2 or 07.2. But I'm not done. I start over because I'm bringing down the last number. 5 goes into 41 8 times. So I put an 8 in the quotient line, and that's 40. So I subtract 40 from 41. And I'm left with 1. Well, you cannot have a 7.28 remainder 1. It doesn't work like that. You also can't make it a fraction, 7.28 and 1/5. No, because fractions are decimals. So you have to continue to convert this to a decimal. So let's take a look at our warnings. You might have to add a 0 to the end of the dividend so you can bring it down to the end of the remainder. So, if there's already a decimal in the quotient, great. You just do that 0 and drop it down. Is there already a decimal in this quotient? Yeah, everyone's going to write, great. Check. There is already a decimal in the quotient. So I get to just put a 0 here. I'm going to use green. And drop it down because I already have a decimal. If I did not already have a decimal, then I would need to put the decimal there and then drop it down. But there already is one. So that's why I get to just leave it. And I start the process all over again, looking at the new number down here, which is 10. Will 5 go into 10? Yes, it goes in twice. So I make this line longer. And what was 5 times 2? It is exactly 10. You have to continue this division process until you prove, I'm going to write proof, until you prove that it can get to 0. Once you've got that proof, then you don't have anything else to bring down. That is your final answer. So I don't say that my final answer is 07.282. That's not how I do that. I say my answer is 7.282. Could you say that number for me in word form? 7 and 282 thousandths. Did you get that right? I hope so. All right, let's try one more before we switch over to the next video. All right, the one we are going to try is, let's do this one. 153.87 divided by 23. Getting harder because we've got now what? Double-digit divisors and decimals. I'm challenging you here. First step, move that decimal straight up. Right in the right place value, make it bold. Separating the wholes from the pieces. Okay, because it's a double digit, I come underneath it and I say, well, 23 is really close to, and I pick a number that ends in 0, or that I have an easy time counting by. I actually have a pretty easy time counting by 25s because of quarters. And 23 is closer to 25 than it is to 20. So that's why I'm going to do that. Okay, so I did the decimal thing and now I'm doing division. Does 23 go into 1? No. You could put a 0 or you could leave it. Does 23 go into 15? No. Same thing. You could put a 0. Like if that stresses you out to leave those blank, you could put zeros or X's, or you can leave it blank. Does 23 go into 153? You bet it does. So I start to use my benchmark number, or 25, to make this easier. So I'm looking for 153. Count by 25s. Ready? Say them with me. 25, and put fingers up as you go. See how I'm putting my thumb up and then my second finger? So as you count by 25s, put a finger up each time, okay? 25, 50, 75, 100, 125, 150. That's 6 times. Could I go 7 times? 175? I don't think so. I think we better try 6. So let's go with our original number and come here to the left side and try 23 times 6. Let's see if you get the same answer as I do. I got 138. Could I go 23 more on that? No, because 20 more would be 158, and I only get 153. So it is right. So 6 comes up here. And now you subtract 138 from 153. I got 15 left over. Then I bring down the 8. And I start all over. Now I'm working with 158. Well, let's just look up here. 23 times 6 is 138, and I can get 20 more, would be 158, but then I'd have to get 3 more. So I can't get another group of 23. Guess what? It's just going to be 6 again. That's pretty cool. So I minus the 138 again. And here's how I know it was right. Because before I even bring down the next number, I look at what the remainder was, and it's 20. I can't get a group of 23 out of 20. So that's why I know it's right, and so I bring down the next number. Some of you are not even checking when you go through these steps. You definitely should. It'll save you a lot of error and mistake. Okay, now I got a big number, 207. All right. Has to be more than 6 because 6 was 138. So let's do 7. What would 7 times 25 be? Or if I had 7 quarters? 8 quarters would be 200, right? Because it's $2. So 8 quarters. 7 would be, I guess, 175. We got to keep going, 207. 9 quarters would be 225. What do you think? Should we try 9 or is that going to be too high? I think we ought to try 8 or 9. Let's go for 8. Let's try the original number. 23 times 8. Do the math. Okay, could I get 23 more out of that? 20 more would be 194, 204, plus 3 more would be 207. Oh, I think it's 9. Bummer, we gotta try it. Don't ever erase when you're doing division and multiplication because you're gonna use it. Oh, there it is. It is 9. So 9 goes on the answer line. 207 gets subtracted from 207. To prove, you're going to write your little proof. It's proof that you got to 0. So the answer is 6 69 hundredths, or 6.69. All right, let's move on. Oh, actually, I'll catch you in the next video.